Mama, I made you something for work. Thank you, baby. I'll put it right in my pocket. I never thought a Friday double shift at Rosewood would be the night someone decided my arm was something he had the right to grab. Azadi had been up since 6 that morning working on it, a crayon drawing on the back of a paper bag, 3 lopsided figures standing in front of what I think was supposed to be the restaurant. She pressed it into my hands before I could get my coat on, both her big brown eyes on me, waiting. I folded it careful and slid it into my apron pocket before I walked through the service entrance. That was 4 p.m. By 9, the dinner rush had thinned, and table 9 had been loud for the better part of an hour. I could smell the bourbon from 3 tables over. Raynard Mercer. He had that look, the kind that isn't looking at you so much as deciding something about you. I'd seen it before, knew what came after it. I kept my voice even, kept my movements small, the way you do when you're trying not to give something a reason to move toward you. I set down the check, turned to go. That's when his hand closed around my forearm. Not a tap, not a grab for attention, a grip, the kind that says, I'm not finished with you. The restaurant kept moving around me. Glasses clinked. Somebody laughed at the bar. A table near the window was taking a photo of their dessert. Nobody looked over. Nobody ever does. What happened next didn't take long, but it felt like it did. The grip on my arm hadn't loosened. I didn't pull away. I'd learned a long time ago that pulling away only makes things worse. It gives them something to react to. So I stood still and kept my face neutral and waited for it to be over, the way I'd done more times than I could count. But before I could think of the right words to calm the situation down, I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back. Not scraped, not knocked, just pushed back, slow and deliberate. I didn't know who he was then, I just saw him stand. He was lean, dressed simply, black hair combed back neat. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't call across the room or make a scene. He just walked over from the corner booth like he had all the time in the world, and he stopped close enough that Raynard Mercer finally looked up from me. Whatever Mercer saw in that man's face, it changed his expression. The grip on my arm loosened. The man in the corner didn't touch him, didn't have to. He said something low, just a few words, and I couldn't catch all of it over the noise of the room, but the tone was clear enough. It was the kind of calm that isn't really calm at all. It's something colder than calm, something that knows exactly what it's capable of and isn't in any hurry to prove it. Mercer let go of my arm. He laughed a little, the nervous kind, and said something about how it wasn't that serious. He dropped some cash on the table, not even the right amount, and pushed his chair out and left, just like that, like it had been nothing, like I had been nothing. The door swung shut behind him, and the restaurant kept going the way it always does, like a seam had just been stitched back up, and nobody needed to look at where it had torn. I stood there for a second, trying to remember how to breathe normally. When I turned, the man from the corner booth was already heading back toward his table. He stopped, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and laid some bills on the table, enough to cover his meal and then some. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something else down beside the bills. A card. Plain, white, just the name printed on it. That was all. He didn't look at me when he did it. Didn't smile or nod or wait for a reaction. He just set it down the way you set down a tip, quiet, without ceremony, and walked out. I crossed the floor and picked it up. The card was thick, the good kind of paper that costs more than it needs to. The name on it was printed in clean, simple letters. Yong Sun Jang. No title, no number, just the name. I stood in the middle of my section, holding it, the crayon drawing still folded in my apron pocket, and the bruise on my forearm already beginning to show. I didn't show the card to anyone that night. I tucked it into my apron pocket beside Azadi's drawing and finished my shift the way you finish a shift when something has happened that you're not ready to talk about yet. Head down, moving, staying busy enough that you don't have to sit with it. It wasn't until we were closing, wiping down the last tables, that Deja came over. Deja had been working at Rosewood longer than me. She knew the regulars, knew the difficult tables, knew exactly which managers to avoid on a bad night. She was also the kind of person who noticed everything, and said nothing until the right moment. "You good?" she asked, not looking up from the table she was wiping. "I'm fine," I said, the automatic answer. She glanced at my forearm. The bruise had come up dark and clear, just below my elbow. I didn't say anything. I just took the card out of my pocket and held it toward her. She looked at it, and then something happened to her face. The easy, tired expression she wore at the end of every shift just left. She took the card from me and looked at it again, like she needed to make sure she was reading it right. "You got this where?" she said. He was sitting in the corner booth. He's the one who stepped in. Deja set the card down on the table like it had gotten heavier. She looked at me and then looked at the door and then looked back at me. "Ayana," she said quietly, "that's not just some man." I went home that night, and after I checked on Azadi and made sure she was sleeping, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my phone. I typed his name into the search bar. Yong-sun Jang. There were a few results, but not many. A mention in a business registry, a name attached to a property company, one short article from 4 years ago that didn't say much, just that he had been questioned in connection with something and later released. Nothing was proven, nothing was charged. Beyond that, the internet had very little to say about him, which was strange for someone who was clearly not a nobody. I texted Deja. "I looked him up. There's almost nothing there." She replied fast, like she'd been waiting. "That's the point. Men like him don't show up in searches. The less you find, the more careful you should be." I put my phone down and looked at the card on my nightstand. Then I looked at my arm. The bruise had darkened since closing. It ran in a band just below my elbow, the shape of fingers still faintly visible in it. I pressed my thumb against the edge of it lightly, not because it felt good, but because I needed to confirm it was real, that it had happened, that a man had put his hand on me in a room full of people, and not one of them had moved. Except one. I picked up the card. I turned it over. There was a number on the back, small, written by hand in clean ink. I called it. He picked up on the second ring. I hadn't planned what I was going to say. I'd been sitting on the edge of my bed for 10 minutes, just holding the card, and then I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. When his voice came through, it was even and unhurried, the same way he had walked across that restaurant floor. "Miss Ellington," he said. Just that, like he'd been expecting the call, like he already knew my name, which I hadn't given him, and which I decided not to think too hard about right then. I thanked him for what he'd done. I kept it short. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said I didn't need to thank him. Then he said goodnight, and the call was over. That was it. I didn't know what I had expected. Something more, maybe. Some indication of what the card meant or what he wanted in return for stepping in. But there was nothing like that. Just a brief, clean exchange and then silence. I told myself that was a good thing. The first time I noticed the car, it was Tuesday. I got off my shift a little after 11 and walked out through the back the way I always did, keys already in my hand. There was a dark car parked across the street and a man leaning against it who straightened up when I came out. He didn't approach me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, visible, while I walked to my car. I drove out of the lot and watched in my mirror as the car pulled out slowly behind me, not following exactly, just present, and then turned off 2 blocks before my street. I sat in my driveway for a moment after I parked. Wednesday, it was the same car, different man. Thursday, same. By Friday, I had stopped pretending I wasn't looking for it. I asked Deja if she'd noticed anything. She had. She'd seen the car Monday, she said, before I even had. She'd assumed it was connected to what happened with Mercer and hadn't said anything because she didn't want to scare me. "Are you scared?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I said. And that was the truest answer I had, because fear was familiar to me. I knew what it felt like. I knew its specific weight, the way it sat in your chest and made everything smaller. What I was feeling wasn't quite that. It was something more complicated. There was unease in it, yes. The awareness that someone knew my schedule, knew which door I used, knew the route I took home, that part was unsettling in a way I couldn't just push aside. But underneath it was something else I didn't want to name, something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. Nobody had ever made sure I got to my car safely. Not once in all the years I'd been doing this, closing late, walking alone, keys in my fists just in case. Not a manager, not a coworker, not anyone. I didn't know what to do with that. I just knew I kept looking for the car, and every night that week, it was there. I saw him before he saw me. He came in on a Saturday, about an hour into the dinner rush, and he moved through the front of the restaurant the way he did everything else, without hurry, without drawing attention to himself, though attention seemed to find him anyway. The hostess started to lead him toward a table near the window, and he said something quiet that made her change direction. She brought him to the corner booth instead. His booth, I was already thinking of it that way, which bothered me a little. He was in my section. I gave myself a moment at the server station, then I picked up my order pad and walked over. He ordered simply, water, no ice, the salmon, no starter. He handed the menu back without looking at it much and then looked at me in that direct, unhurried way he had, like he had nowhere else to be and no reason to pretend otherwise. The restaurant was full. I had 4 other tables. I came back when his food was ready, refilled his water, and was about to move on when he spoke. "How is your arm?" he asked. I stopped. "Better," I said. "Almost gone now." He nodded once. Then, "The drawing in your apron. You had one last week as well." My hand moved to my pocket without thinking. I'd put a new one in before my shift. Azadi had been on a sky phase lately, every drawing full of clouds and birds, and something she kept insisting was the moon, even when I pointed out it looked more like a potato. "My daughter makes them for me," I said. "She gives me one before every shift." Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, it was small, the way a light changes in a room when a cloud passes outside. He glanced at the pocket and then back at my face. "How old?" he asked. 7, I said. "She'll be 8 in the spring." He was quiet for a moment, not the awkward kind of quiet, the kind that has something sitting inside it. "What is her name?" he asked. "Azadi," I said. He repeated it, just once, softly, like he was making sure he had it right. Then he looked down at his plate and I could see that whatever had moved across his face a moment ago had not fully left. He was working to put it somewhere. He was not entirely successful. I didn't ask about it. It wasn't my place, and something about the way he'd gone quiet told me it was a door he wasn't ready to open in the middle of a busy restaurant on a Saturday night. Maybe not anywhere. Maybe not yet. I checked on my other tables and came back twice more before he finished. When I brought the check, he had already set his card on the table. He signed the receipt and stood to put his jacket on. And then he paused. "She is lucky," he said, "to have someone who carries them with them." He left before I could respond. I stood at the corner booth for a second, the signed receipt in my hand, and looked at nothing in particular. Then I reached into my apron and touched the folded edge of Azadi's drawing, just to feel it there. My mother called on Sunday morning, which was not unusual. The way she called 3 times in a row before I picked up was. She didn't say much on the phone, just asked if I could come by that afternoon and bring Azadi. Her voice had that particular flatness it got when she was holding something back, keeping it controlled until she could say it to my face. I told her I'd be there by 2. When I arrived, my sister Camille was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. That told me everything about how the next hour was going to go. My mother waited until Azadi was settled in the back room with the television on before she sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. "People are talking about a man, about you." I didn't ask how she heard. My mother had a network that operated faster than anything I could explain. Camille pulled something up on her phone and slid it across the table to me. It was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance, of me and Young's son at Rosewood the Saturday he came in. I was standing near the entrance and he was beside me, closer than I'd remembered. We'd only talked for a minute after his shift ended. It had felt like nothing. Apparently, it looked like something. "Do you know who he is?" Camille asked. "I know his name," I said. My mother leaned forward. "Then you know enough to be careful." They took turns after that. Camille had looked him up the same way I had and found the same near nothing, which she had interpreted the same way Deja had. My mother knew his name from somewhere older, some conversation she'd have heard years ago, attached to a part of the city that sensible people didn't involve themselves in. They weren't shouting. That almost made it worse. They were scared, and they were showing it to me plainly, the way people do when they love you and don't know what else to use. I listened. I didn't argue. I drove home with Azadi asleep in the back seat and my mother's voice still sitting in my chest. That night, after I put Azadi to bed, I opened my phone again. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I typed his name one more time, but this time I went further down the results than I had before, past the business listings and the brief article, until I found something I had missed. An obituary. 3 years old. Park Ji-yeon, 31, and below her name a second one, a daughter, 6 years old. Survived by no one. I read it twice, then I set my phone face down on the mattress and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about a man sitting alone in a corner booth on a Saturday night, ordering simply, leaving without lingering, carrying nothing visible, which I now understood meant he was carrying everything. I thought about the way his face had changed when I said Azadi's name. I didn't sleep easily, but something had shifted, quiet and permanent, in the way I understood him. The week after my mother's kitchen had been quiet in a way that felt temporary. Mercer had posted bond 10 days after the incident at Rosewood. Deja told me before I could find out another way. She'd heard it from one of the bartenders who knew someone who knew someone. That was how information moved in this part of the city. By the time it reached you, it had already been true for a while. I hadn't seen him, hadn't heard from him directly, but I felt the knowledge of him being out there, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, something in the air that sits differently, that makes you check the locks twice and park a little closer to the entrance. I was on my break on a Thursday when my phone buzzed. Unknown number, no name. I almost didn't open it. It was a photo. Azadi, in her purple coat, the one with the star on the back pocket that she'd picked out herself. She was walking out the school gate, her backpack pulling at her small shoulders, her ponytail bouncing. She wasn't looking at the camera. She didn't know it was there. It had been taken that afternoon. The timestamp said 3:08 p.m. No caption, no message, just the image. My hands started shaking before I fully understood what I was looking at. Then understanding caught up, and my whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I stood up from the break room table and sat back down, and stood up again. My mind went to the police, to the report I could file, to the restraining order that was already in place and had already meant nothing once before. And then I called Youngsun. I didn't decide to. My thumb was already moving. The phone was already ringing. He picked up on the first ring this time. I said his name. I said there was a photo. My voice was not steady, but I kept talking, kept describing what I was looking at. The purple coat, the timestamp, the school gate. I talked because stopping meant the fear would take up all the space. And then he went quiet. Not the polite quiet of someone listening. Something else. The kind of quiet that has a weight to it, that changes the feeling of the air on your side of the call. I stopped talking and just held the phone and felt it. That stillness on the other end that was not empty, not passive, not the quiet of a man who didn't know what to do. It was the quiet of a man who knew exactly what to do and was already deciding it. "Is she there now?" he asked. "With you?" "No," I said. "She's at my mother's. I drop her there on shift days." "She stays there tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "Send me the photo," he said. I did. There was a brief pause. Then, "Go back to your shift. I'll call you at closing." I understood then why I had called him before the police, not because I trusted the darkness in him, because I trusted the quiet. It was Azadi's idea to hold his hand. That was the part I kept coming back to afterward. I hadn't suggested it, hadn't nudged her toward him or tried to make the afternoon feel like something it wasn't. She had simply decided, somewhere between the entrance and the first row of flowering trees, that she wanted to hold his hand, and so she reached up and took it. Young Sun looked down at her small fingers wrapped around two of his, the tattooed ones, the ones that had always made him look exactly like what he was, and for a second he didn't move, like he had forgotten how to respond to something that simple. Then he adjusted his hand so she could hold it better, and they kept walking. It had been 4 days since the photograph. He had called at closing the way he said he would, and he had spoken carefully, telling me only what I needed to know, that the situation was being handled, that Azadi was safe, that I didn't need to change my routine. I had wanted to ask more. I hadn't. We had already established, without saying it directly, that there were questions I wasn't going to ask and things he wasn't going to explain, and that this was the arrangement we were both living inside of. The botanical garden had been his suggestion, something calm, he'd said, for Azadi, just an afternoon. She had dressed herself, which meant she was wearing the purple coat again and one yellow sock and one white one, and she had her drawing pad tucked under her arm before we even got to the car. By the time we reached the garden, she was already narrating everything she saw in that specific, urgent way she had, like the information would be lost if she didn't release it immediately. Young Sun listened to all of it. He didn't talk down to her or use the slow, overly bright voice some adults use with children. He just listened and occasionally asked a question and let her lead. She showed him a flower she decided looked like a hat. She told him that bees were actually nice if you didn't bother them, which was something she had told me at least 40 times, but delivered to him with the full weight of original discovery. About an hour in, she stopped walking and looked up at him. "You don't have your rings today," she said. "No," he said. "You had them at the restaurant," she said. "You took them off and put them on the table." She thought about this. "You're the ring man." Something crossed his face, surprise maybe that she had been paying that much attention, or that she had held on to it. And then he laughed, a real one, short and a little rough, like it had come from somewhere that didn't get used often, like his throat had briefly forgotten how. Azadi looked very pleased with herself and went back to her drawing pad. I stood a few feet behind them and watched, the afternoon light coming down easy through the trees, Azadi's ponytail bouncing as she walked, this quiet man beside her, carrying something that looked, from where I stood, almost like relief. I recognized the feeling. I was dangerous close to having it myself. He knocked on my door at 9:30 on a Tuesday. Azadi was already asleep. I had been sitting on the couch with a book I hadn't been reading, still in that low, restless state that had become my default in the evenings, too tired to do much, too unsettled to fully rest. When I looked through the peephole and saw him standing in the hallway, I felt something that was equal parts surprise and something I didn't examine too closely. I opened the door. He was wearing a clean shirt and his jacket was folded over one arm. His hair was in place. Everything about him looked composed and deliberate the way it always did, except for his right hand. The knuckles were swollen, 2 of them split and dark at the edges in a way that fresh clothing couldn't balance out. I looked at his hand. He let me look. "Come in," I said. He sat at the kitchen table while I put water on. I didn't ask about the knuckles. I didn't ask about Mercer. I had made a decision somewhere in the last 2 weeks that there was a line running through the middle of whatever this was, and that some things lived on his side of it and some things lived on mine, and that the arrangement only worked if we both respected where that line sat. I made tea. I set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. He looked at the cup for a moment. Then he said, "Her name was Jian." I went still. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the cup and spoke in the same even tone he used for everything, but underneath it was something stripped down and unguarded that I had not heard from him before. He told me she had laughed loudly, that she had been the kind of person who filled a room without trying, who left dishes in the wrong cabinets and sang while she was cooking, and never once seemed to notice how much noise she made. He told him that her daughter had been the same way, loud and bright and constantly in motion, always dragging him somewhere to show him something she'd found, a bug, a cloud, a cracked piece of pavement that she had decided was shaped like a bear. He said the house had been loud for 6 years. He said he had not understood what that meant until it stopped. He didn't tell me how they died. I didn't ask. The obituary had told me enough, and the rest belonged to him. When he finished talking, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city was settling into its late-night sounds, a car somewhere, a dog, the low hum of everything that never fully stops. I reached across the table and set my hand next to his, just near it, an offering, not a claim. He looked at it for a moment, then turned his hand over slowly, just enough that the side of his palm was touching mine. We sat like that until our tea went cold. I didn't fill the silence. Some things don't need to be covered over. Some things just need someone willing to sit inside them with you. He stayed until the city outside went quiet. Then he said goodnight, and I locked the door behind him and stood in my kitchen for a long time after. Azadi gave me the drawing at the door, the way she always did. But this one was different. She'd used more colors than usual and taken more time. I could tell by the way the lines were careful instead of rushed, the way she'd gone back and filled things in. 3 figures standing together in front of a building that I recognized as Rosewood, with the red awning she always drew too big. The first figure had a round face and coily hair. The second was small, with a ponytail and what I knew from experience was supposed to be a purple coat. The third was taller, with straight black hair, standing close to the other 2 but not quite touching them. Like he was choosing his distance carefully. Like he understood that some spaces needed to be earned. I folded it the same way I always folded them, along the same creases, and slid it into my apron pocket. "That's my good one," Azadi said seriously. "I know. That's why it goes in the pocket." She accepted this and went back inside, and I stood on the step for a moment before I walked to my car. Rosewood looked the same. Same red awning, same host stand, same low lighting that made everything look warmer than it was. The dinner rush came in the way it always did, loud and then louder and then suddenly thinning out, and I moved through my section the way I had 1,000 times before, taking orders, refilling glasses, clearing plates, reading the room. But something was different in the way I was doing it. I wasn't bracing. I hadn't noticed how much of my energy had been going into that, into the low, constant readiness I carried through every shift, the part of me that was always halfway scanning the room, always half prepared for something to require managing. It had been there so long I had stopped feeling it as something separate from myself. It had just been how I moved through a room, how I moved through most things. Tonight, it wasn't there. Or it was quieter, at least. Quiet enough that I could feel the difference. I checked on table 9 without hesitating. I walked past the corner booth without looking at it. I carried 4 plates at once and made a table of 6 laugh and talked to first-time customer through the menu and did all of it without any part of my mind somewhere else, without any part of me already preparing for what might go wrong. At the end of the night, I cashed out my tips and said goodnight to Deja and walked out through the back door. The parking lot was ordinary, just a parking lot, concrete and lamplight and a few other cars still waiting. I got in, I started the engine, I pulled out of the lot and onto the street, and I drove. I didn't check the mirrors, not once, not the rear view, not the sides. I just drove through the quiet streets, past the lights turning yellow and then red and then green again, all the way home. I parked. I sat for a moment in the silence. Then I reached into my apron and took out Azadi's drawing and unfolded it carefully in my lap. 3 figures under a red awning, the city going about its life outside my window. I breathed. Just that. Fully, and without thinking about it. I was beginning to understand, the beginning of something. If you enjoyed watching this story, kindly like and comment where you are watching from. If you love these kind of stories and many more, consider subscribing to our channel, Arden Brings Stories. Thank you for watching. Till next time.